Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Broom Closet Briefing podcast, episode 2. And I'm your host, Broom. And today we are going to talk about a little bit on what went on last week. My, what a week it was, right? Um, I do want to talk a little bit about what went on and the big news in the media. Of course, the Minnesota development. And then we're going to go a little bit into the predictions that I made last year and this year on some of the things that are upcoming that are connected to this incident. And then we are going to go over a little bit on the other headlines that are flying under the radar but are equally important because let's face it, it's a crazy news cycle, and that's why I think independent creators like us exist. Although Broom Closet Briefing is not a regular news outlet, it is a news with a twist of divination and other analysis. So I have a lot of new subscribers who subscribed over the last week, and I welcome you to this space. I am extremely grateful that you trust what I have to say and my analysis and the support that you're giving me. Thank you so much for being here with me. All right, let's go into the opening without much further ado. Some weeks they arrive kind of like a warning, and they don't feel like political events or like another exhausting cycle of American news. They feel more like bone deep vibration of something unresolved, which is waking up again and again stretching itself out, and it's demanding to something old to be confronted. The moment the Minneapolis story broke, the moment the words, there was a mother who was shot during an ICE encounter near, like after her school drop off, or like where the ICE operation was ongoing, and the moment that entered the national bloodstream, I would say that old vibration returned with a force that was almost architectural. And you could feel it through the walls, you could sense it in the air, you could watch the country again stiffen in the way a body all of a sudden, becomes, stiff when it recognizes the exact shape of an old injury. Minneapolis is not just a city. It's a symbol that is engraved into the psyche of this country. I hope you know where I'm going with this because it's the same location of the murder of George Floyd, which was not merely an incident of police brutality. It was a fracture in the facade of American democracy that exposed every unfinished conversation, every buried truth, every racial wound, and every political lie that we collectively pretended not to see for years. And Minnesota and Minneapolis became the epicenter of an international awakening at that time. And then, in the slow, predictable, soul crushing way that America often operates, that awakening was politely filed away so everyone could again return to their regularly scheduled programming. But here's the thing, right? History really has a long memory, and wounds have a remarkable ability to reopen when the conditions mirror the original trauma. So when ICE agents they opened fire near that residential area and killed a mother who had just dropped off her child to school, like a regular person like you and me, and I for that matter saw so much of myself in her because that is my exact routine in the morning. I drop off my kid to school and then go about return to like my regular business, and it could have just been me or you or my best friend because we all have a very predictable that kind of a routine, and ICE was in my city too. I would say Minneapolis did not experience a new tragedy. It experienced a repetition, The city just slipped back into a kind of spiritual deja vu, as if the ghosts of 2020 again stepped forward and whispered, like, you have not learned anything, and you haven't healed, and you still haven't understood what we were trying to show you. So, in spiritual sense, a lot of the time we go back, revisit the old wounds because we opened something karmically and we had not resolved that karmic wound. So what I'm trying to get here is, like I said, it is a news outlet but with a twist. I do think that this whole thing, this with the whole like the whole similar touch points of the same person in charge this time as well of the nation, the same city, same location, again law enforcement and a civilian execution. It has to be something that we karmically opened the first time and we did not resolve it. You could hear the echoes of 2020 in the neighbors' voices on the recordings, their panic, their disbelief, their exhaustion, and you could sense the frustration, the statements from local officials, like who were clearly bracing themselves for that national spotlight they hoped they would never see again. And you could feel the grief in the community again in a way that was not just about the woman who died, but about the realization that an entire city's trauma had again been reactivated by a government agency which is so drunk on power and unrestrained by any meaningful oversight. So, America reacts to events like this with an uncomfortable blend of familiarity and avoidance, be it school shooting or be it something like this. Familiarity, because we have seen this pattern so many times that it has become coded into our reflexes. Avoidance, because we do not want to admit that the pattern is so structural, not accidental, structural. The country's response was not shock, it was frustration, fatigue, dread, and the heavy, creeping understanding that what we are seeing is the inevitable outcome of institutions that were never reformed and were, in fact, militarized even more, even further. And then, as if summoned by that faint scent of a spotlight, of course, the DHS secretary, Kristi Noem, she inserted herself into the narrative with a speed that defied both taste and logic. So, before the investigators could even finish their first briefings, before the family had time to mourn the deceased woman and comprehend their loss, before the city of Minneapolis had even begun processing what had happened, Christy just stepped forward, assumed like her signature posture of the performative, like the frontier heroine that she is. And I often draw her that way. And surprisingly, she actually kind of dressed up that way for that whole, like press briefing that she did right after that incident. And she again began issuing pronouncements with the confidence of someone who basically believed that she owned the truth simply because she said it out loud. Her tone was brisk, her statements were all rehearsed, and her intentions were just that she was not seeking any clarity, she was just seeking camera angles and propaganda. So she was not standing with the grieving community at that time, okay, which is should be the the role of a leader, but she was positioning herself above it and spoke with the kind of certainty that reveals not strength but basically fragility, and the certainty of someone who has mistaken attention for leadership for so long that she now cannot tell the difference anymore. This is not the response of a leader. So, this was the response of a woman who sees tragedy as merely a prop and America as her audience. And in that moment, I would say her entire political personality, the personality we have studied through tarot for months now, it cracked open like a cheap stage set under the floodlights. So, I would go into Kristi Noem's arc a little bit on what we have predicted so far. And in my first episode, I actually did mention that part of the prophecy that I made in the last year has not yet come to fruition, that I predicted that she would be removed, and just I just did not know the course of the events at that time. And now looking at the Minnesota events unfolding, it kind of clearly points to that. And let's look at some of the things that I've already predicted based on the readings that I did last year and this year as well. So, to understand why Christie's response was so disastrous, we need to return to the readings we did on her in 2025. And that one mapped out her political psychology with very like a lot of precision, I would say. So that spread did not depict a leader which who navigated a difficult landscape. She that depicted a woman who was playing a role that was written and scripted by somebody else, and a woman whose sense of identity is basically just stitched together from archetypes rather than any kind of principles. So she was not here to lead in any way. If you had that thought in your head that okay, maybe we should give her a chance because she would be because she was the governor of South Dakota, so you would think that she knows how to lead anything, but looks like that was just like a whole imagination, right, that never came to fruition. So she has always curated herself like she's the like the main character of a frontier drama, and she leans into this whole aesthetics of ruggedness, which you would see that all the time, of the maternal toughness, unwavering conviction of a woman who could straddle maybe a horse while reciting constitutional amendments, although I would argue she probably knows nothing about any constitutional amendments, or even know that how many there are. There are 27, by the way. Because remember that very famous, congressional hearing that she had to sit through, where she was asked what habeas corpus was, and her answer was habeas corpus is a right that the president has. And she had no idea what habeas corpus was, which is basically a very like I mean, if you're working in law, like in government, you probably should know this. I mean, I guess common people do not know this, that's okay, but a, for a government official should probably know that. Anyways, going back to the readings, it showed us the truth that she's not the main lead. She's basically a prop, and she is the ornamental face of a political movement that values imagery far more than competence. And her job was never to lead, and her job was basically to embody a myth. And we looked at her energy last year when we saw this woman whose power existed entirely in a borrowed form, like her costume or her makeup and all of those things, like as if like she's just borrowing everything to like put up a facade of like a show, and then she takes off her makeup and goes back to her normal life, something like that. Like she has no political gravitas of her own, and her relevance comes from her proximity to the orange tyrant, and her persona is shaped not by the internal strength but by external expectations. So all she does is like projects authority the way a mirror would project sunlight, as a reflection and not a source. The cards basically showed us someone who was clinging to this identity, right, with the desperation of a person who would know that if she lets go for even just a second, she will basically just evaporate into oblivion. And they showed us this figure terrified of insignificance, and a woman who basically understands at, I hope, at some subconscious level, that she is actually replaceable, and she exists in this political ecosystem, even though being a loyalist to this regime, where the moment she basically, if you stop serving the central narrative, you will be discarded the next moment and without any farewell or anything. So this is why her reaction to the Minnesota incident carried such a like a distasteful, pungent aroma of panic, because she cannot adapt her persona to the moment, because her personality is all she has, and she cannot soften because softness would basically contradict that fantasy. And she also cannot wait for facts because patience contradicts that personality. She cannot approach tragedy with humility because humility would contradict the myth of that cowgirl, like frontier justice, autocratic embodiment she has spent years rehearsing. So Minnesota did not merely show that she lacks empathy, it showed that she lacks any range. And I guess if she was actually a professional actress, she would also probably fail in that job. So she's probably not a great actress either in that way, right? I mean, yeah, putting on costumes and kind of cosplaying that's okay, but even anybody watching that knows that's fake too. So that means she's not even doing a good job at like projecting that this is what is real. So we as the audience, for even for one moment, is not mistaking it to be real. So that's a bad performance, right? So it revealed that she does not know how to step out of character, because there is no character beneath that character. So there is only performance, and held together by her hairspray and botox and you know f- lip fillers or whatever, those Mar-a-Lago injections that they put in their faces. All the women have kind of the same kind of like facial stuff done to them. And now the regime, basically the one that she serves, a regime that has always treated its loyalists as disposable, is basically shifting at this point. So if you look at those readings, there is a King of Wands character, which we all know who this person is, who has hovered in the background of her readings for months, is not her champion. It's basically her executioner. And I mean, not literally, but more like politically. And he is the man who will decide that Christie's usefulness has expired, or that her removal is necessary to preserve the storyline. Her fall was written months ago, so Minnesota simply like delivered the inciting incident. I would point towards those two readings that I did. One was done back in summer of 2025, and the follow-up one was done this week. I will link those two readings in the show notes of this episode, and I would urge you to go look at those two predictions, and they actually document what's coming very well in that. And I'm not giving, I'm not going to give you, I mean, I'm not giving out any plot points here. So it's a good read. I'm sure you won't be disappointed in that. Next, I want to move on to the concern that a lot of people have is, what about ICE, right? I mean, how an agency became this machine, and which is like literally at this point equivalent to have being a paramilitary force on the streets. And I want you guys to remind you that ICE was actually kind of, it was formed during, I think, right after 9/11, and during the Bush administration, because of what went on in America at that time. And at that time, it looked like it was a necessary thing to do, to because the nation was just grappling with a terrorist attack. And but after that, especially in this administration, this agency has now become this machine that is rogue and out of control. So Christie is only a surface fracture in a much deeper structural unraveling. The readings we did on ICE last year that reveal not just the future of an agency, but the future of state power as exercised through that agency. So ICE is not merely an enforcement body anymore. It's like a barometer of how an authoritarian government kind of wishes to function and wishes to become, right? So when Congress like poured unprecedented funding in that big, beautiful bill last year into ICE, outpacing every other law enforcement body in the country. It was not just a gesture of bureaucratic efficiency, it was a signal of intent, and it was the federal government inflating a force it planned to rely on, probably in ways that reach far beyond the immigration enforcement. And I'm not going to tell you that that's something that will happen, because I mean it. I Let's not deny the fact that it is a wish list to use that as a paramilitary force, but wishing that and actually being able to execute that, and given to the fact that we have seen that how poor of an executioner this current regime is, I will kind of have my reservations on that. But this is why we read on ice in that article, which I would link below in this show note. The energy around the agency felt very, very unstable and overgrown and kind of mutated as well. So, like something you built to be small that has suddenly been instructed to kind of like grow fangs and tentacles and all of those things. So, it was a warning sign at that time that if you're pouring that much funding and money into an agency that doesn't have like little to almost no oversight, then this kind of a situation was bound to happen. So the first spread actually revealed the glossy facade that, they would like pose themselves as this, the group that is keeping the nation safer and present this public facing narrative of order and professionalism. But beneath that facade, it lay disorganization and confusion. The reading basically showed us an agency whose internal cohesion was basically weak, whose morale was decaying, and whose true operations were clouded in obfuscation. So, the second spread actually revealed the downfall of when it came would come through. Wait for it, some kind of digital exposure, not through activism alone, not through whistleblowers alone, but that reading clearly stated through undeniable documentation like camera footage, screenshots, or some kind of data trails. And what do we have in the Minnesota situation? The ICE agent who shot Renee Nicole Good uh, was recording it in his own phone, the whole incident. And there are several other footage of the bystanders who recorded that incident. The kind of evidence that enters the public domain and refuses to be reinterpreted. No matter how the propaganda machine tries to spin it, it will not be spun into something else. The kind of evidence that even the most disciplined propaganda machine cannot overcome. The third part of that reading showed that there will be hearings, restructuring, budget slashing, and an institutional backlash. It also showed that ISIS power would not collapse overnight. Of course, nothing does, but would be chipped away by public rage, amplified through hearings, testimony, journalism, and political infighting. It also showed that a moment would arrive when the machinery of ICE, overloaded and overstretched, would crack under its own contradictions. So I saw this thing coming, like an undeniable digital documentation which will take down ICE. I just didn't know that that would cost somebody's life. And um, I mean, I think that is a part I'm not being able to come to terms with, because um, a life is lost. Some children, they lost their mother, a partner who lost their partner, a community that lost this woman who was part of their community. It feels like a big price to pay, but I guess certain things just probably works that way. Minnesota activated all these, right? The footage that contradicted ICE's narrative completely, and even the footage that the ICE agent who is responsible for this shooting, was recording it in their phone, also contradicted the narrative of the propaganda machine. Now, we also have the airlines that were partnered with ICE for the deportation flights. They have started to refuse to work with them. Members of Congress have now began whispering about oversight, and public anger has sharpened. And suddenly, the agency that was engineered to operate in the shadows is being dragged, blinking and snarling into the light. So, ICE is confronting the exact fate the cards predicted. Um, it was exposure, erosion, and internal reckoning. just that a life is lost, that it's not just a life that was lost, was that the damage that has been done, like it is so much more than just Rene Nicole Good's death. And I would like to extend my condolences to her family, who her children who survives her, and her partner. And I know that we are keeping her in our thoughts at this point, and fighting for the justice that she deserves. All right, very heavy. So I want to kind of include this section in this podcast episode, that we there was a very heavy week last week, and all everybody, each and every one of us, our eyes were peeled on the news, probably either watching the footage, which was very triggering, or reading more about how this thing is developing, the story, the protest, and all of that. There are a few things that flew under the radar, and I always do go to the other news that a lot of people are not covering. And I think these tiny brittle fractures, even though they seem like they're not much, but I do think that each and every one of them adds up to this regime being dismantled in real time. So Christie's collapse, ISIS exposure, Minnesota's activation, they're all occurring against a backdrop of a broader political environment which is cracking at its edges. And the headlines this week, they do not simply report this crack, they will basically illuminate them. These are the ones that you probably haven't heard of, or maybe you did but brushed off. So let's go over them. The job growth had slowed down to the metric of it was during the pandemic. So during pandemic, it's like now equivalent to that. So the job growth slowdown is not simply an economic number, it is the soft underbelly of an administration whose legitimacy depends heavily on the illusion of prosperity. So when the economy weakens, the authoritarian theatrics begin to feel like liabilities rather than assets. And this is an election year, and this is going to hit them hard in terms of what the voters think. This is not a no, this is not a light situation. So many companies have filed lawsuits at this point. The lawsuits filed by over 1,000 companies against this administration's tariffs are not merely a legal action. I say they are a revolt of the financial class, and which is funny, thinking the financial class revolting against the Republican Party, which does not challenge a president unless it senses that he no longer possesses the stability or influence required to protect the interest. Moving on to the Greenland humiliation, like humiliation of United States in the world stage regarding Greenland, while Denmark responded that they're going to shoot first and then ask questions later. They respond with not with just diplomacy but with veiled warning. This is an embarrassment of this country. It is a symbol of the United States losing the performative aura of global dominance that the authoritarian leaders rely upon to maintain internal control. And if you're worried about Greenland in any way, I really would want you to go read the prophecy that I made regarding Greenland and see how that is going to shape up. I will link that reading in the show notes as well. Congress blocking the unilateral military action in Venezuela. Again, it's not an administrative inconvenience. It is basically a sign that the legislative branch no longer trusts the executive branch to act without restraint. And that's a big thing. It shows a very definitive internal fracture within the party. There are many, many court rulings that push back against his ideological overreach this week. They are not just judicial routine, they are the judiciary remembering that it does have a spine. At least the other federal courts do. I can't say the same about the Supreme Court all the time. The implosion of MAGA media with influencers, they're attacking each other literally on air, and narratives fracturing beyond repair. This is not just a petty squabble, okay? So it's a death of a propaganda machine, and that once, this is the same propaganda machine that held this movement together this far. you know on on one hand, the MAGA media is fracturing and falling apart. What is surging is a democratic organization and fundraising, which is a good sign, a very good sign for election year like 2026. There are many airlines that are partnered with ICE for deportation flight, and there are a few of those partnered airlines are refusing to cooperate with ICE w- on the wake of this Minnesota incident. It is a symbolic rebellion, that's sure, but it is a moment in which corporate America looks at the federal enforcement arm and says, we do not have to do this. So, taken together, these headlines do not describe an isolated crisis. I want to iterate that. They describe a system entering its brittle phase, and the stage where every part kind of begins to like fracture like simultaneously, because the structure itself can no longer support the weight of its contradictions. So in closing, I would say the spell is breaking, so we need to keep this circle active. What we are witnessing right now is the unraveling of a political architecture that has, I want to say, relied for years on spectacles. I mean, at 10 years at this point, in my experience, if not more, and on spectacle, intimidation, and illusion. And those illusions are now collapsing. The spectacle is now completely falling apart. The intimidation is beginning to like kind of go boomerang. Kristi Noem is failing because her persona cannot withstand exposure, and ICE is faltering because its machinery cannot withstand accountability. And partially, I want to say that it doesn't really have a structure, right? Something like, if it doesn't have a structural foundation, it is going to eventually fall apart. So the headlines are not background noise, they are the prophecy that turning into a timeline. And as this spell breaks, because it is breaking, the only way to remain oriented, I would say grounded and unmanipulated, is to stay within a circle of people who can read the signs clearly. And it doesn't have to be me, whoever you think is doing breaking it down without like the bias or with more like critical analysis. So, if you want to continue watching this collapse with eyes sharp enough to interpret it and intuition strong enough to decode that, make sure you follow my podcast, The Broom Closet Briefing, on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to it. Following keeps the spell active, it keeps you inside the current, and it keeps the analysis, my divination, and the magic flowing into your feed the moment the next thread of this unraveling begins to tug at the world. We do not simply observe history here, we read it, we interpret it, and we conjure it as well. And we are witnessing this transformation together. In closing, also, I would like to say that I am extremely thankful to everybody who listened to my first episode, and it was a huge success in Substack's metrics, at least. And I have no words of like which will be good enough to thank you for the support that you give me. Where else to find me is obviously on Substack, and I have a Patreon with the same name, the Broom Closet Briefing, and I offer tarot Lenormand courses on my Patreon, and I also have a Broom Closet Coven, which is a membership where we are practicing um, this this genre of spirituality, and I also offer a Patreon only podcast in my Patreon where we talk about occult, esoteric, and spirituality in its many form. All right, and thank you for staying with me on this episode. Please leave me a comment, a like, a review, wherever you're listening to this, so that it is pushed out to more people who do not know that I exist, and they can find me as well. And I will see you guys next week with another roundup, and let us keep the spell of justice alive, because the other spell of illusion is breaking. Don't be a doomer, be a broomer. And I'll see you guys next week. Thank you.